I want to just read out something to you about tonight's guest, because I didn't want to miss anything out. Tonight's guest is Ken London. Now, Ken has been a member of St Mary's for not too many years, and he's based mainly at the centre, but he recently became church warden. But the last few years have been a time of real testing for him and his family, due to the illness of his daughter-in-law in Australia. We're going to talk about that and about his life working in the fire service for over 40 years, and the issues he's had to cope with over his work. This should be a testing listen for all of us. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Ken London.
Thank you.
Just let me take my watch off.
Oh dear.
Here we go. Ken.
David.
It was weeks ago that I approached you about allowing me to interview at Sundays at 7. And I was delighted that you agreed, but at the same time, I was aware that the last few years have been an extremely difficult time for you and your family. And in the second part of tonight's interview, I'd like to talk to you about that time and how you, and for that matter, the rest of us, are able to cope and come to terms with close family loss. But let's start many years back. Let's go back to the beginning. Ken London grew up in the 1950s, living adjacent to Liverpool Football Club. You were an only child and had a basement bedroom and an extended family of your mum's sister and her 2 children. You said it all felt happy and quite normal. What are you remembering about the early days?
I must admit, it's only since I've sort of reflected on what we talked about that I thought, actually, I did live in a basement. But it didn't seem strange at the time. It was where I lived. It was our living room, our dining room, washing up in the back. We had a toilet outside if we wanted it, but one inside as well.
Wow.
So we were posh. It was a rented property, but we did live with my aunt as well. And for me, growing up was, I would say, just a normal child growing up. There was always an adult in the house because my mum worked, I can't remember which way it was now, but let's say my mum worked in the morning, my aunt worked in the afternoon. So there was always a female presence there, and obviously the men were out working. So for me, it just felt a normal childhood.
Do you look back on that with a smile on your face?
I mean, I wasn't a bad lad. I enjoyed, I suppose, the mischief of growing up, because I did have a friend who lived in Anfield Road who had one of the big houses that went down to Stanley Park, a huge big garden. And we'd love to play around, and sometimes in the summer months we might camp out or something and sneak along everybody else's garden at the back, because you couldn't see, it was a huge distance away. But I just think it was a normal childhood. I was certainly very happy. My parents weren't pub drinkers, if you like, but would enjoy a drink at a party. Family do. But I was quite happy with my life as I was growing up.
Your cousin Mary took you to the Brethren Sunday School, and you had a church grounding until your 12th birthday. Looking back, how important were those 12 years, and who in particular kept you on the straight and narrow during that period?
Yeah. That's probably the hardest question you're going to ask me tonight, actually. Mainly because I don't remember most of it. Because I think the memory's beginning to fade. I do remember going to Sunday school, and I remember being told that Mary took me in the early days, but she got married when I was 7 and moved away. But in terms of what we learned, I mean, they were the standard Bible stories that you hear in a Sunday school. And I'm not too sure how much of that I particularly remember afterwards, other than just remembering. And it was I could see, I need to tell you the story very briefly. And plainly, when I did become a Christian later on, I started going around to preach at lots of different churches. And I went to preach in a church in McGull. And I recognised somebody there who was one of my old Sunday school teachers. Yeah. And as I was preaching, I looked at him, and I could see in his face the pride he had in saying, "This is one of my lads come good." Yeah. And as many people know, it doesn't take much to get me going crying. And to try and hold that together once I saw his face was very difficult. But I can now, being probably, even although old, slightly younger than he was at the time, I can look back now and see the same thing applies to me, that I can see people who I've had an influence of doing well, leading church. You know, it's a huge, lovely feeling.
Which schools did you attend up to, say, the age of 16? Yeah,
only the two. The primary one was Anfield Road Primary School, and the other one was the Liverpool Institute, the grammar school, which is now LIPA. Yeah. Yeah, those two. Yeah. And funnily enough, since I've been here, there is also somebody else here who was at the same schools at the same time, roughly, which was fascinating to talk about. When David, I don't want to embarrass him, because he told me not to, because he said, "I'll thump you if you tell them." No, sorry, he didn't say that. No. But it was just to meet somebody in the same church these years later, being in exactly the same schools at the same time, was different. Yeah.
Moving on a bit, in 1967, you joined the Liverpool Fire Brigade as a cadet.
Yeah.
Why?
The glib answer is that I believe God told me to. Well, that's it, really. There's obviously a story behind that, of course, which, am I all right to tell that story?
Yeah.
Okay. When I became a Christian, it was in my last year of school, just before my 16th birthday. And I wanted to join the army because another relative of mine was in the Royal Signals. He's my cousin, who, I don't remember it, but he also lived in this house. But he moved out before I can remember to another house as they were rebuilding following the war. I wanted to follow him. But once I became a Christian, the leaders in the church were suggesting, really, you'll be away from home, you'll be, out of, not our reach in the sense, but probably out of Christian influence. Pray about that and ask God if that's the right thing. So I realized it wasn't the right thing and started to figure out and pray about what I was going to do. I had a few thoughts. One was to join the police, so I went to the recruitment, because my dad had been a special policeman before the war, and I know it would have pleased him. But I went, and they, bearing in mind I'm just 16, and they said, "You need to grow a bit and lose a bit of weight." So I think I probably would have made it eventually, but not just that put me off. I thought about becoming an educational welfare officer. Thought about it, and that was it. And then a guy in school who couldn't have been a fireman because he wore glasses. And in those days, you couldn't wear glasses and be a fireman. So he gave me a leaflet about the cadet scheme. And I know exactly the days. That was on a Tuesday. I took it home in the evening, and it was just a leaflet, advertising leaflet, and I thought, this looks interesting. So as I was going to bed, I started to pray about it. And while I was praying, a fire engine went along the bottom road with its, I can't remember whether it was horns or bells at that point, but it's obviously a fire engine because you know from the deepness of the engine that it's a fire engine, not another emergency vehicle. And then I opened my Bible to start to pray about it, to read my notes for the day. And believe it or not, it was Revelation, the lake of fire. So I took that as a hint. I filled the form in, which was only like name and address, really. Gave it in because I had to go to school through town. So I went in and handed it in on the Wednesday. On the Friday, I got a letter back from them to say go for an interview on the Saturday on the entrance exam. And if I hadn't have made that, I wouldn't have gone because that was the last, if not the only one, entrance exam for the fire brigade. And then, of course, ultimately, a couple of months later, got a letter saying, yes, join us.
You're in.
That's it.
You've worked in the fire service in various capacities most of your adult life. But in 1969, you were posted to Belvedere Road Fire Station in the Dingle and attended your first fatal fire with 3 children and their father died. And you said that to this day, you can still picture the scene of walking into that room. How did you cope with that at that age and presumably afterwards?
I mean, at the time, it was a job and you got on and did the job. I mean, it was awful to just walk into a room that was effectively burnt out and to see the bodies wasn't nice. The mum, by the way, who did survive it all, was actually blown out of the 2nd-story window onto the floor. She was waiting on the window ledge to be rescued when sort of an explosion occurred and a fireball went through the house, pushed her out. So she fell on top of a bus that had pulled in underneath to help her get down a little bit. She slid off the top of the bus and onto the floor. So the first thing I saw was her lying in the road, but there were people around her. And then the rest of it was ultimately putting the fire out and, of course, being told to go in. Because the one thing that they would try and do is to get you blooded, if you know what I mean. So go in and see it, because you've got a career ahead of you. You don't know what you're going to see. And to be fair, it was one thing that I remember was that on the dad's hand, he had a watch that had stopped at 2 minutes to 9. Now, that bit I can still picture. And you just got on and did the job, and it didn't seem to, until I got home, and my mum, because I was living at home then, my mum said to me, "You're late this morning getting in," because it was the end of the night shift, it was the early, about 7 o'clock in the morning, or no, it was just a bit later than that. And she said, "You're a bit late." And I have to be honest, I just broke down in front of her and told her what I'd been to. And I just went up to the bedroom and slept. And although I've never had any dreams or nightmares about it, I can still walk up those stairs into the room and see the scene.
I'm sure.
Yeah, but it's never been a problem.
You became a Christian at the Liverpool Empire at a crusade in 1966. And I think you had a profound experience of the Lord Jesus during that event. Tell me what happened.
Yeah. It was the Empire Theatre, so it's a theatre. I'd already been on the Wednesday because I had to go past on the bus to get to school, past the Empire Theatre. So if I'm honest, I don't remember what it was that drew me to it. But there was something obviously of interest that made me go on the Wednesday evening. And I just don't remember anything about that except being embarrassed because the collection box came round. I fumbled for my money, and there were two ladies sitting next to me who just started going, and they wore hats. It's funny the things that stick in your mind, isn't it? So I just passed it and was really embarrassed. But I went back on the Friday and took a friend this time. And just while he was speaking, I just was in a world of my own and just had this vision of Jesus on the cross. And it's funny because, you know, in that song that the band sang earlier about the eyes, look into the eyes of Jesus, it's funny because that's what I was fixated on. I don't know if they knew that, but that's what I was fixated on. That it was almost like a TV shot of him on the cross. His head was bowed and he lifted up his head and he looked straight at me and said, "Do you know why I'm here?" And I said, "No." And he said, "It's because I love you." And then he bowed his head. So at the end of that, I've no idea what the guy was talking about, but at the end of it, they did an altar call, I think it's called, you know, when they come forward if you want more info. So I did. Saw somebody behind the scenes, and the rest is history. Because my response to Jesus was, if you did that for me, then I'm going to follow you. And yeah, that's the beginning.
Going back to, I suppose, personal family matters, you first met your wife, Marge, who's here tonight, so she'll be keeping an eye on you, when you were 7 and she was 9. But the friendship went downhill when she broke your record. What happened?
We met at a wedding. You mentioned Mary earlier on, and I said she got married when I was, I don't know if I said I was 7, but she got married when I was 7. She married Marge's uncle. So we met at that wedding.
Right.
And at the wedding, we played together, as you do. I'm sure everybody here, because I think most are old enough to know what a dumbwaiter is. It's not a stupid one. It's one of those little lifts where they cook the food downstairs, put it in a little lift, and go upstairs. So you can imagine, I don't remember being food in there, but I remember we went in there. So it's sort of stuff like that we were playing. So, of course, when the wedding was over and a few days later, Marge, who's just very slightly older than me, very slightly older.
We'll come to that.
Yeah. Came round to play. And this happened, I think, for a few days when she came round to play. And we'd sit on our front doorstep and listen to a couple of records that we had. The old 78s, the ones that you put in the oven and moulded when they were no good anymore, you know. And now that's showing my age. And my favourite was Champion the Wonder Horse by Frankie Lane. Now, it was a television programme at the time, and of course, it called Champion the Wonder Horse, and that was the soundtrack to it. Well, on one of those occasions, she sat on it and broke it. And that was the end of the relationship.
I can understand that.
There's only some
completely.
things a lad can take.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm with you 100%. However, you met up again in your late teens after you'd become a Christian.
Yeah.
You were 16 and she was 18. But Marge felt there was more than 2 years difference between you. You started going out together properly when you were 19 and you married just weeks after your 21st birthday. Tell me about Marge and how special she is to you.
Yeah. She wasn't special because of that. that record. The memory's still there. But
This is being recorded.
But I did meet her again. I ultimately went to the same church. When I started going back to the Sunday school church, I didn't quite fit in. Believe it or not, I was quite shy. At one point, and that point in my life, I was shy. And I didn't fit in there. And fortunately for me, just a few weeks after I became a Christian, the Sunday school superintendent took me down to a meeting down there that was an annual meeting of Merseyside Christian youth camps, then in that particular year, 1966. And I met the young people who were in that church, and they welcomed me with open arms. And one of those was Marge. But if you bear in mind that Marge is a little bit older than me, at that point, she, only a bit, but she was working and I was a schoolboy. So there's a world of difference between somebody at work and a school kid. So, I mean, when we first met, she was a cradle snatcher. But then when it came to that little bit later, she wasn't really interested in me. So I had another girlfriend from that same group. So I went out with this other girl, and while I was doing that, Marge was going out with her brother. It was very close. It was very,
I got you.
Yeah, it was very close. But eventually he became our best man when we got married. But it was, I think fairly early on into that relationship, I felt that she was special. And I do remember fairly early on saying, do you think we'll get married? And she said, let's leave it a little bit longer and see how it goes. But we did.
Yeah.
And part of the reason was there was just something about her, obviously, you know, but she has always been very caring. When we first met, she was involved in going round old people's own homes and flats and things, and decorating for them and doing bits and pieces like that for them. And she was caring. And then she made the right decision to care for me.
Which is very handy, because the next question, I asked you for your recipe for a happy marriage. Can you remember what you said?
I think two things. One would have been, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't keep things. Don't let them fester between you.
He said, keep short accounts.
That's a good way of putting it. Yes. Yeah. I wish I'd have thought of that first.
Yeah. And you also said,
oh, thanks.
Brilliant. Love your partner more than yourself.
Yes.
You go along with that, would you?
Yes, I think that's very important. If you really love somebody, you want them to prosper more than you want yourself to prosper. I believe. So we've often moved around a little bit over that period, mainly because she likes still helping people. And so I say we because we went together, but she became manager of a number of different sheltered housing schemes to help people. And that was her deciding that that's what to do. And we knew it was the right thing to do together. And I enjoyed it just as much as she did, but she was obviously more face-to-face with people than I was.
In the second part, we're going to talk about your faith, your family, the highs and lows of life, and your hopes for the future. But before that, we're going to have another song performed by our band, and it's a song that you've chosen yourself. I think it was written by City of Light. I think it's called There Is One Gospel. Was there any particular reason for choosing this song?
I think most people here know Nicky, our now moved on vicar. I think we probably both discovered City of Light at the same time. Yeah. And because I remember standing at the back talking about which one do you really like, and I really like this one. And now we've begun to sing their songs as well. Yeah. And this is one of their latest ones. But the first line and the first verse, I'm hoping I might have it here, because, yes, when I looked at the lyrics of this for the first time, I thought, wow, there is one gospel on which I stand for all eternity. It is my story, my Father's plan. The Son has rescued me. And it goes along in the same vein. And I just love the lyrics, all the lyrics of the song.
We mentioned at the beginning, you're a deep thinking and an emotional person. And I asked you when we met up, were there any low points in your life? And you mentioned a time when you allowed work to take over everything, including your Christian life. And I'm sure a lot of people here can relate to that as well. And you stopped going to church. How did you get back?
Yeah, it probably was, and yet in a strange way, as I reflect on that, I can still remember, even though I wasn't going to church, walking and having conversations with God, praying, whatever it might be, but just having these conversations. I was asked to start a PR department in the fire brigade, and it was something I passionately believed in and wanted it to work, both from the way in which we present the fire brigade to the public and also fire safety. I think seeing those three children did something in terms of wanting to try and not have that happen to others. So that became so important that I'd often go, funnily enough, I introduced a character called Welephant to the fire brigade. He was already around. It was a figment of a young girl's imagination in Manchester. She entered a competition. And he became, very quickly, one of the mascots for fire safety in the fire brigade. And because I was in that field at the time, I actually introduced him to Merseyside Fire Brigade and became passionate about that. So we'd often go out, believe it or not, as a family. I think all of my children dressed up in this Welephant outfit. And I'd be standing in uniform talking to people and they'd be doing that. Or the colleague that I worked with who was absolutely brilliant. We just got this thing going for doing school visits and out in public events on a Saturday because we both believed in it and we did it. So only left the really only free day was a Sunday. And it just seemed that everything was more important than going to church. And I think once you stop having that fellowship with people, things begin to slip. And that's what happened. I knew that had happened. So I kept talking to God and saying, zap me. You know, that sort of, just as I'd experienced before, just as Paul on the Damascus Road was blinded, zap me, you know, and it just didn't happen. And how it happened and why it came about on a particular day, I don't know. But for whatever reason, I hadn't read anything from the Bible, so I don't know why it happened. But it just really dawned on me one day. I gave my life to Christ because I believed he died for me on Calvary. And now I'm saying, but it doesn't mean anything. When in reality, I know that even if I walked away, because I was going to church one day a month, that was it. And I just knew I couldn't turn my back on it. And I just knew inside me that even if I walked away from that, he still died for me. And in the end, realized, actually, I can't walk away from it because it's always there. And I know that he loves me. And I can't turn away from that. And so I came back to faith after about, I always call it my wilderness years, in the sense that Nebuchadnezzar had 7 years of being a bit doolally. I only had 3. But when I came back to it, it was just at the point that a very close friend in the church that I was going to moved his job round that made it, he had to go abroad a bit. And so I came back, and after a period of time, took over his responsibilities. But it was just the realization that I can't turn my back on the truth.
Yeah. All of us, I believe, can relate to times when we're down, when things aren't so good. And in 1985, you had some bouts of depression over your dad's death. This is becoming more and more commonplace today, but we don't always talk about it.
Yep.
We don't like to talk about it. How did you get through it?
Initially, I didn't know it was depression. My dad died in the February of 85, and it was a couple of months later when I was feeling under the weather. And I actually remember, because this was also towards the beginning of setting up this particular department. So I was actually working on my own in a fire station. And I actually remember being almost down to the bottom in this, and not knowing what it was, why I was feeling right. And I thought, I'm going to bang my head on this desk in work, and, you know, maybe if I go unconscious, people will find me, and I'll find out what's wrong. So I did bang my head on the desk, and thought, that hurt, I'm not doing that again. But I did go to the doctor, and the doctor said I had a viral infection. So I can't remember if I had medication or not for a viral infection. I just don't remember. And then came back out of that again. Now, I have to say, when I was in that period of depression, it was an awful place. If anybody said, how would you describe hell? I'd say it's the place I was when at the deepest part of this depression. So you sort of go downhill for a couple of days, be at the bottom, and then come out of it again a couple of days later. And the only thing that got me through that, pardon me, was Marge, who would read a psalm to me. I didn't want to see the kids. I just couldn't see them. Certainly didn't want to see any visitors. But Marge was there, who would read a psalm, and I'd just lie there. Then that happened a second time, and exactly the same. And then a third time, a couple of months later, I realized I needed to go to the doctor again. There was a second, it's a viral infection. Yeah. And the third time, it was a different doctor. And it was an old-fashioned doctor who said, quite bluntly, it's not a viral infection you've got, it's depression. And I walked out of the surgery, crying my eyes, well, I was trying to cover it up, but crying my eyes out, thinking, I'm a Christian, I can't have depression. But then went through that period. When it happened for the fourth time, went to the doctor, it was back to the original doctor, and said, I've just got to get to the bottom of it. And she said, you know what that means? And I said, I think so. And it meant seeing a psychiatrist. And that hurt as well, to think that I needed to see a psychiatrist. So the day came when the psychiatrist was coming, and I thought, please don't let it be a foreign doctor. I want to be able to understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
Don't want any accents. I just want somebody who can plainly tell me what the situation is.
Yeah.
The guy pulled up in front of the house, opened the door, got out, and it was an Asian doctor. My heart sank. I'm not going to be able to understand him. He walked in, sat down, started speaking the most perfect English I've ever heard anybody speak. And within 5 minutes, he drew out of me what it was that I hadn't mentioned, or I don't even know if I realized what it was particularly until he brought it out then. And what it was my dad died, and I believed he was in hell because I hadn't told him about faith in Jesus. He didn't quite fully understand, plainly, but he did say, do you not think that the life you led leading up to that was sufficient? In other words, we'd put it now as, did you not witness to your dad? And I had done. But it's just that because he had fought the Japanese in the Second World War, he had some horrific memories of that and didn't want to talk about anything to do. I mean, he didn't oppose anything I did, and I know he loved me, but he didn't want to know anything about the Christian faith. And then, as I said that, I realised, in actual fact, the doctor was right, that we would always say, when they were there, well, we always used to anyway, we'd make sure that we said grace before a meal when they were with us as well. So it was just the things like this, and the realisation was, well, I got that one wrong, didn't I? But it took a while. And as soon as that happened, it was over. As soon as I sort of blurted that out. So he just knew how to draw it out, and then that was it.
You're on the road back?
Yeah. I've
I've
never minded talking about that.
No, and I hope you didn't mind me mentioning it tonight, because it's important.
Yeah.
And years ago, we buried these things. We mustn't.
Yeah. I mean, I on one time that I was preaching at a church, I wasn't going to say that, but I felt there was a need to say it. And somebody came to me at the end and said, I found it very helpful because I've been there and I'm still having problems. And we just briefly talked, and he was okay, But
Can I just say at this point as well to people here, if there are things that Ken mentions tonight that you relate to, what have you, please don't just leave it. Come and have a chat with him afterwards. He'd be delighted to speak to you. I've mentioned a couple of times tonight your family issues, particularly over the last few years with your daughter-in-law, Kristen. Can you tell me the background to this and what happened?
Yeah. We used to go over, since we both retired, we went over every year around about January, mainly because that's the long summer holiday period for school children.
This is in Australia?
In Australia. And we would go over and childmind, because they were still relatively young at that point. As it stands now, they've just had the birthdays, and they're 17 and 15. But if you go back to the sort of late what were the years called, the 18s, 19s, that they were still young, and we would childmind effectively. We'd planned on going, and we'd booked the flights to go for, I think, probably a month or 6 weeks, which is what we did. We planned that for January 2020. But mid-December, our son phoned up to say that she'd been rushed into hospital. She'd had a blockage of the bowel and was having an emergency operation. So we do you think we should come over? And he said, yes, please. So we changed the flights and went over. We actually landed on my birthday in December 2019. Actually, we were quite surprised because she was quite chirpy. Even before we got there, we'd seen a photograph taken of her in hospital, and she had a big smile on her face. When we got there, we then found out that the diagnosis was that it was a tumour that had blocked the bowel, and that was why it caused the pain and the need for her to go to hospital and have the operation. And following on from that, they did all the investigations and realised that it was bowel cancer. And even at that point, I think they told her that the prognosis, although they don't like putting dates or anything on it, it's normally about 5 years life expectancy after that. I can't remember how long we stayed for. We were talking about this. We don't remember exactly how long we stayed at that. But she was still at a relatively good point at that stage, even though she'd just had the op. They booked to go away with a couple of other families that we knew for Christmas. We actually went with them, which is not what we were expected to do.
Was she aware of this prognosis?
Yes. And all the way through, she'd been very bright. Now, plainly, there were times when she was in pain, but she'd always been very bright and continued working unless she'd had an operation or something. So that was in the January of 2020. Of course, we were still there thinking about it. Do you recall that was the very beginning of COVID, of course? And we were, do you remember when the people were bussed into Arrow Park Hospital who'd had that special flight from Wuhan? Yeah. We were actually still in Australia when they were bussed in. And I thought, oh, that's it, that's around the corner from where we live, you know. And then we realised, actually, although we'd had a date for coming back, this is getting potentially a little bit serious. We better get back, otherwise we might get locked out. But anyway, we got back, and then there was just no visiting then. Everything was in lockdown, so we couldn't visit. So everything was done via Skype or, you know, Meet or one of those WhatsApps things. So all the conversations were through that. Melbourne was hit very strongly. That I think they had their lockdown was much more severe than ours was. Except that, of course, they could still go to hospital because she had various treatments that she was going to go through. So a little bit later on, another large part of her innards, for want of a better term, were removed. And I think from the very beginning, she was on a colostomy bag? One of those bags, you know, on a bag that she seemed to cope with very well. But it was just extremely difficult not being able to be there.
Were the children aware of the situation?
They were informed all the way through on the scenario and what was happening. Yeah. Obviously, over that period of time, the big thing then was that it would have been late 2022 that they began, Australia began to lift restrictions. Because it mightn't have interested most of you, but that they didn't allow even their own citizens to come back home. Right. They were locked out. So round about November of 2022, they opened up for their citizens to come back, and one exception. And the exception was parents of Australian citizens. And they had Australian citizenship. Yeah. I have to say, we had to jump through hoops to get the relevant visas and stuff. Much more intense than a standard visa. Even to the point that at one point they got back in touch to say I'd got the visa and Marge hadn't, because we hadn't provided enough evidence that Ben was Marge's son.
Yeah.
So we ultimately got over that one. But
You were
yeah.
saying the prognosis was 5 years.
Yeah.
How long did she actually live for?
4.5.
4.5
Yeah.
years. This is critical to what you said before. During this period, were you looking for a complete physical healing from the cancer? Or were you perhaps more philosophical about it? And was your own personal faith in God tested in any way during this whole period? So, to start with, were you praying for a complete healing? Because I know people here were.
Yep. Going to say at the very beginning of this part, we are so grateful for the number of people that we know were praying for us as a family. And to be fair, I think that's probably what got Marge and I through it, is knowing how many people were praying for us. Not just here, but in other churches too, who knew us and knew of us and the scenario. And I feel that that's what sustained us through some of the darkest periods. And I think the really darkest periods was when we went over in September, when Ben said to us, because we always said to him, if anything happens and she starts deteriorating, we'll come right away. And it came to the point last September, not the one, last month, last September, that we were at that position.
23.
23, yeah. And if I'm honest, it was really hard to see somebody in so much pain as she was at that particular point, because they were battling to get the pain under control. But she was still at home. So it took a day or so for them to come to the team that came to the house. It took a while, a day for them to come, and then to get medicines and treat her. In that same period, our daughter came over for a couple of weeks, and she said, I'll take over from Ben, because Ben was caring for her effectively.
Yeah.
And our daughter came over and said to Ben, I'll go and sleep in the room and do what needs to be done overnight. And Ben could go into a caravan that was parked on the front drive of the house for this period for various reasons. And that morning I got up early, she heard me up, came out to me and said, that's the list of medicines she's had. She's been up 27 times in the night, and I'm shattered. So it was my turn. But prayers, absolutely, we were praying initially for that full healing, yeah. It's what we wanted. Yeah. And you pray for what you want.
Absolutely.
And that's what we wanted. I think as time went on and her health was getting worse, in my mind, I never ever articulated it, was that we're going to have a real miracle or she'll pass away.
Yeah.
I think by the time it came to that September was the realization that she was going to pass away. Did I ever question God about it? No. We are a fallen society, a fallen people. For the large part, many have rejected God and all that God stands for. And we are generally a fallen people. In fact, the whole history of humanity is as a fallen people. The great thing for me and for anybody who trusts is that, yes, we're a fallen people, but I'm still loved by an almighty, powerful God who created me, who knows everything intimately about me, all the things that I do wrong, all the things that aren't wrong. He knows me intimately.
Was and is Ben a Christian, and was Kristen a Christian?
No, I don't believe so. Although in some ways, I think all of the children have, well, they've all gone through Sunday school and church, because you do as a family, don't you? But that they're not practicing in any way. And I'm not too sure that they've ever made professions, but I think they've sort of said so, but they're not following in any way at all that would indicate that they have a faith.
I said to you beforehand, we prepare the questions and we never get through all the questions because the time runs out.
Yeah.
And we haven't got much time, so I've jumped a few now.
Yeah.
But I want to come to some... Thank you for sharing all of that with us here tonight. A couple final questions. You're now a member of the Church of England, but I suspect that you possibly struggle with some issues within it. You feel that since COVID, we've turned in on ourselves and lost sight of those people without a saviour. Very briefly, what would you like to see change?
It's a broad statement saying we've turned in on ourselves, but I think that the necessary isolation has made us turn in on ourselves and really become more inward looking rather than outward looking. I'm not too sure that we're yet fully as evangelistic as a church should be. I'm talking about the whole church, but I include our church in it as well. I think we do pretty well in many ways, and people are coming to faith through the work in this church. But we could do better.
Okay. Finally, how is Ken London enjoying being church warden?
Becoming a firefighter was God speaking through scripture and prayers. I left there and started working for Merseyside Christian Youth Camps through God speaking and prayers and promptings. Becoming church warden was not something I had in mind. But Nicky wrote a couple of days before Easter this year and said, would I consider it? And I said, let me pray about it. And I think I got her email on because we were still in Australia at this point. Yeah. I got an email on a Wednesday before Good Friday. On Good Friday morning, I got up with the intention, because we were away for the weekend because it was Easter weekend. Ben's got this little shack in the forest, and it is a farmer's shack. He's done it up a little bit. So outside, it's a shack. Inside, I wouldn't say Buckingham Palace, but it's very comfortable. So we were there for the weekend, and I wake up very early these days. So I was sat on the porch in what was a lovely morning, Good Friday morning, and I took my Bible and said, what should I read? I didn't want to do my notes for some reason. But what I did do was I suddenly thought, actually, back home, it's Passover time. It's the evening. So I thought I'll read the account in John's Gospel, because it's the only one that gives the intimate account in chapters 13 to, well, including 17, the prayers. So I started reading chapter 13, verse 1, which was about Jesus doing the washing of the disciples' feet. The little talk with Peter about wash all of me, and then when he dealt with Peter, he started explaining about what it's like to be a servant. And then on verse 17, it says, so now that you know these things, effectively, you ought to do them. And I realized that was God telling me, yes, do it. Yeah. So I emailed Nikki the same day and told her why I'm saying yes.
Well, I think you're doing a great job already, and I think you're going to do a great job over the next 4 years, well, whatever it is.
Yes.
It's been a pleasure to interview you and talk to you tonight. It really has. Ladies and gentlemen, Ken London.
Thank you.